Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of Lowdown. Today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Cody Royle, author of The Tough Stuff and also podcast and host of the famous podcast Where Others Won't. Cody, welcome to the show.
Connor, thanks for having me, mate. It's nice to meet you and really appreciate the invitation to come on.
No, we've already been discussing briefly off air, but obviously a big fan of your work and long may it continue. But obviously we look at this in early 2022 now, Cody. You obviously hold a nuanced and privileged position and perspective within the coaching profession. I suppose the question on everybody's lips really is where and kind of how did it all begin?
Well, you were just sharing your story with me beforehand about getting into coaching young, and it's my story too. I was an elite AFL player. I was in the Victorian squad at every age group that you can be in the Victorian squad, which if you know anything about Aussie rules football, I think still well over 50% of draftees come out of Victoria. So, the state around Melbourne. And I didn't get drafted. So I'm probably still one of the only people to have made all those squads and never made the top level. And that caused me to fall out of love with the sport, quite frankly. And it was coaching that made me kind of reignite my passion for Aussie rules. And so I was coaching at 23. And so, kind of sitting here now with 15 years of coaching experience at the age of, 38. It was a little bit happenstance in that, I just happened to take on roles and then got an opportunity to coach open age men really early. That led to a national team. And it's just kind of been, as we were talking about beforehand, walking through doors when opportunities presented themselves, and then a little bit of also creating opportunities in the coaching space as well.
And 15 years of coaching is quite a long time. Has your why changed throughout that period in terms of you start as that, eager coach, willing to dive in, willing to learn everything, possibly at the risk of overkill at the start, to the position where you are in today now, where you're not only optimizing yourself, but optimizing elite coaches?
Yeah, the why didn't exist when I started. There was no such thing. We weren't talking about, this, kind of high level, aspirational thing like we are now. It was, a little bit about the game. You can structure the game, how to deliver messages, you can build training plans, that kind of thing when I started. And so I very much started in that mold. And I thought that the game was all about X's and O's, and I could do that at a really high level early on. I understood the game from a space and a perception perspective when I was really young. But now, having moved through, coached open age men, international men where they're learning the game, having coached some, juniors that have gone on to get drafted, in the top 10 in the AFL. It's certainly made me think more about why I'm doing it and what I'm hoping to get out of it. The goal was always to be one of the first non-playing coaches in the AFL, and that's certainly changed now, and much more about impact on the people that I'm working with on a day-to-day basis, which now is head coaches, hilariously.
And were there possibly any key milestones in terms of how that why changed, in terms of your main goal being, I want to be the first non-AFL playing coach out there, to what you're actually doing now? Or was it something which you were led to reflect upon throughout just working in the game?
Honestly, I think it was probably through starting my own podcast and going on the adventure that I've been on with Where Others Won't, that probably made me do the reflection. So that was my own coach education. So, there's no AFL coaching conferences to go to in North America. And so I decided to create my own and having access to people like Adam Grant and Dan Pink and authors, academics, head coaches, they, speaking to them, as challenges your own ideas. And so I think my acceleration has been rapid by having access to those kind of people. And that's probably changed my perspective from a very goal oriented, I want to be this, and I want to be, there's a time element to mine as well, the first. That no longer exists. So maybe my answer is a little bit of both, through having access to certain people and speaking to them, and then also the fact that that time has elapsed and I've gotten more mature as I've gone along as well.
Fascinating to unpack. However, I wanted to draw your attention, in fact, to one statement which you've made on a recent podcast, Cody, where you say, "I believe coach optimization is the greatest barrier to team success in elite sport." With that at its pillar, could you please take us inside some of the techniques and practices, in fact, that you use to help coaches unlock more of who they are?
Yeah, so I do believe that. I actually think, I think a lot of what we've been trying to do with teams has kind of commoditized itself. So, fitness came along, and for the most part, we've figured that out. And, we're talking about 0.01% improvement, and ultimately, teams are winning because they don't have the injury toll that other teams have. And so, a lot of things have balanced out over time: resources, salary caps, soft caps, all that kind of thing. But one area that hasn't been explored has been the actual coach themselves, the head coach, and their own optimization as an individual, and also as a master technician. A lot of these guys and girls are in the top 30 in the world at what they do, and there's a lot more left in them. And I think the kind of emotional toll and the physical toll that's taken on them means that they don't have access to their primary coaching skills. And so the process that I go through isn't too dissimilar to how you coach players. We go through and, you want to talk to the player and understand where they're starting from, where our relationship is starting from, where they think they can improve, where they know their super strength is, whether they're put into positions to use that super strength, what the barriers are to all these different facets of their craft. For coaches, that tends to be that they're just, they start off as downtrodden. Usually it's the organizational politics or the organizational dynamic is a key pillar, in that there is so much, pardon my French, bullshit going on in the organization that they can't even get to the coaching bit. So or when they do, it's far below expectation, like their own expectation of themselves. And so, there's a process of going through to try to remove some of those barriers, but then also your pretty standard, optimization ideas, like, okay, well, what gives you energy throughout the day? Is it going for a walk? Is it going for a run? Is it reading a book? Is it hanging out with your son? Is it just being in the sunlight? Is it quiet time? How do we find times to get that on your calendar, and how do we keep you accountable to those? And really going through and almost line by line doing an audit of what they're up to, all with the idea of getting them closer and closer to their natural talent to coach, and their ability to, have access to their awareness, have access to their decision making, and have access to their communication skills as the primary coaching skills for a team sport coach.
Sounds as though you were not entering that conversation, though, as the protagonist in terms of asking questions, more or less that they need somebody that perhaps who just needs to listen and be there for them. It just sounds like unmet needs. And we know most of these organizations, Cody, right? They have no shortage of terms of resources, but perhaps the attention just really needs to be redirected a bit more efficiently. In terms of the coaches you deal with, is there any, I suppose, opportunities for greater dialogue with the organisation as to how to better coach, not how to better coach the coaches, but better coach the people who are responsible for the coaches' welfare?
Yeah, definitely. Just to your first point, it boggles my mind, and I point this out pretty regularly, how much everyone wants to look at every single X and every single O that Pep Guardiola and Eddie Jones, put out onto the field, and that they'll spend the whole week in between games on coach paint, drawing circles around everything and arrows. But the reality is Pep Guardiola has his own full-time coach that's dedicated to him, that works internally at Man City, Manel Estiarte, and Eddie Jones has his own full-time dedicated coach that works with him, Neil Craig. And so if you want to copy something that these guys are doing, the top echelon of coaches in the world, you kind of have to look at the whole ecosystem about how they're preparing themselves, more so than whether, Pep's wing backs come inside or overlap. So, that sure they fit together, but you also need to look at how they're preparing themselves as well. So the answer to the question is, yeah, absolutely. There's huge opportunity for organizations, and a lot of these organizations, have multiple coaches that this could benefit. It's not really just the head coach, but I've specialized in that role for what I do. So I only work with head coaches. And that's because they have, one, the power to make change for themselves, in that they're not really taking direction from anyone else in terms of how they organize their day, or how they think. And then, also just, they have the influence for what they're doing to flow down to assistant coaches, academy coaches. So they, them going home early on a Friday, match day -1, has a knockdown effect to everyone else. And so I'm trying to work with the real influences, which is, the head coach.
Yeah, and I think there's a danger in the prescription is in the dose, really, when even I can say within the current environment, which I am, in terms of Dubai and United Arab Emirates, there's a lot of freelance coaching. I think we as coaches have a responsibility that when we sign up to be freelance coaches too, like a common misconception is, we're judged by the value of our work, right? But the value of our work is a unit of work. What's a unit of work? You're getting paid to coach on an hourly basis. So if you get what I mean, Cody, the coaching points start to become a lot more redundant. You're doing things for the sake of doing them. It's not part of the overall package in terms of the more holistic development side of things. But I also wanted to draw you back to your last podcast, which you did on Where Others Won't with Owen Eastwood, which was fantastic. And I would implore everybody to listen. And you spoke about the old adage of the one self-aware person in the forest. He's easy prey for the wolf, right? But if you have a second self-aware person with him, it's not that they're not easier prey, but they can work together to fend them off. So getting back to your original point, this is all part of the ecosystem. It's all part of the broader picture. What are clubs and what are organizations doing nowadays to bridge that gap?
Not much. There are some very forward-thinking organizations that are looking at it from an organizational perspective, and they've realized, whether it be through the coach that they currently have, whether they realize through the abuse cases that are front page of the news, so almost being shamed into it by the fact that they've overlooked coaching and coaches and their development for so long, that now they're basically thrust into having to think about coaching because they're on the front page of the newspaper, or whether they've had an epiphany. There are some, very few, but some that are really thinking about it at a high level. And they're kind of the ones that you would expect. But, the thing is, there's so much room for it in every organization. Like if you were to completely obliterate the coaching practice in a club and rebuild it, it would look very different to the way that it's built right now. If we were to do it based on what we know from a scientific perspective, what we know from a coaching perspective, I think we would hire differently. I think we would plan differently. I think we would allocate our resources differently within the club to coaches. And so, in greenfield environments where there's kind of nothing, we would do vastly different things to what we're doing currently. So, I think that's ultimately my point, is there's a lot of organizations that aren't thinking about this, and they also have no appetite for change anyway.
What's the smallest possible step they can take?
An organization?
Yeah.
I think having an awareness that there's a problem, because there is a problem and I'm talking at the elite level. Again, my context isn't youth sports. It isn't amateur sports. I deal with open age professional sports, and a lot don't have any idea that there's an issue with coaching or coaches. It's just not in their awareness. And that's really what maybe two of the chapters in the tough stuff were trying to point out was, and I could have kept going. I stripped them back because it felt like I was punishing whoever was going to read it with all of the crap that I could have written about. So I did strip it back. I could rewrite the whole book again with new examples, but there is a problem here. And what I'm trying to do is say, let's not wait for something drastic to happen to rectify it, because unfortunately, like it's getting pretty close to something drastic happening to one of the coaches. And we don't need to wait that long to make the change. We have the resources, as you said. We have the awareness that most of us have the awareness that there's something wrong. We just need the appetite to change it.
And I think a big problem about this, Cody, too, is that it seems to be a universal one size fits all. The questions we ask of coaches, the demands we put upon them are universal. But in most instances, the answers to them themselves have to be individual, right? Seems as though, we've been sidetracked down this road of needless complexity for years, when all along it's simplicity, it's humanity, basic fundamental values that seem to be the answers. For the coaches which you coach, how important is the role of unlearning to move that step forward?
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the biggest steps, I would say, particularly early on, is the unlearning piece. And, the thing is that I hear all the time that head coaches don't want to learn. People come to you and say, oh, they're stuck in their ways. They don't want to learn it. That's not been my experience at all. I speak at conferences all around the world, and the people that are the most enthusiastic or will drive across the whole city the next morning to have a coffee with you and potentially maybe miss their flight because they've done that just to have a conversation about something that you said on stage, are head coaches. And so they will learn. They're not going to listen to everything that is thrown at them. And so when you start to direct their attention around some things that maybe they need to unlearn from what they picked up through their playing or early coaching career about what coaching is, that's one element. Often, unfortunately, it's unlearning a lot of what they got on their badges. And then also just social elements in terms of behavior and human behavior, because there's a lot in that package as well, especially nowadays where you've got international teams. And so you have to understand cultures, literally, 20 something countries coming together in a football team, and having to understand the uniqueness of all of those different cultures and the nuance to their communication and the nuance to how they are motivated and socially motivated or individually motivated. And that can differ between whether someone's from a particular part of the world, and now bringing that back together, that's a very different narrative than coaching in the 50s, where everyone was probably an American and you just kind of used war examples and said, get out there and we're going to go to battle. And it's far more nuanced now. And so unlearning that kind of rah and teaching coaches or directing their attention back to the craft and the humanity and the nuance of what we do is, that's really what I do.
In terms of Cody Royle, I suppose, what were the key pivotal moments for you in terms of making that move from Australia to Canada? Firstly, what did you have to unlearn? And then secondly, in terms of changing your why, having that wrapped up in your identity, wanting to become that first non-playing AFL coach, to now what you do, which is unbelievable, providing elite coaches with that top support network. What did you have to unlearn?
Yeah, I came to Canada because Australia is a big island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and we're insulated. We don't have any neighbors, technically, right? Not attached to anyone. New Zealand is the closest, and Papua New Guinea, and from where I'm from in Melbourne, that's a 5-hour flight. So, you're very remote, and so unlearning that, particularly what we're fed by the media about our own importance in the world, was why I wanted to leave, because I wanted to go and experience it and see, do people care that we have an election on at the moment, or that this person did this? And so, very quickly you learn when you're away from home that no one gives a shit about Australia and what they're up to and whether they've got an election on. And so I wanted to go and experience that from the other side. And, the process for me has really been almost 18 years, I think, of trying to undo that connection to not being drafted as a player, because that was what I'd attached all of my identity to. None of the university courses interested me whatsoever. And so when you're an 18-year-old kid and you only have one goal, and it's to do this one thing, and you don't get the opportunity to do that, and there's nothing else that's particularly interesting, you're pretty far down the river without a paddle. And I probably spent 18 years, including a vast majority of my coaching, trying to reattach my identity to achieving something in particular, because I was just replicating the pattern that I had as a player. And so, like I said, probably through Where Others Won't, writing that book, starting that podcast, that started to change. Became far less about achieving something in particular and far more about the impact that you have on other people, and having joy in those small wins.
And you envisage this as a continuous ongoing process, Cody?
The changing of the why?
Yeah, in terms of learning, in terms of unlearning, in terms of changing the why. You mentioned the podcast and the book as a great sounding board to check fundamentally your narrative, check what you're learning, check whether it stands up to practice itself. But for you, do you envisage that ever stopping?
I don't think so. I'm a new father, so I've had to unlearn a lot in the last year, and relearn a lot. And, that's just another example of, it being thrust upon you, like the change, and you can either lean into that or you can, push against it. I'd rather lean into it. That's what I've done, since I left Australia, is really try to create opportunities and learn consistently and upskill consistently. And so, that's another example. And I don't know, you had a second child, and then it changes again. And then, and you buy the house and it changes again. And you, get a call one day out of the blue from an NFL team. Do you want to come and work for us in a new city? And it changes again. And so, I I don't see why not. And then the second piece to that is I actually have no concept of wanting to retire. Like I actually want to keep working and keep challenging myself later in life. Like I'm not trying to get to 65. I want to go well through 65, and whether that's writing books or whether it's actually working or whether it's, just continually learning, I think it's such a great way for us to have some longevity and some impact in the world to keep going. So that's kind of my perspective at the moment.
Especially, yeah, you speak about curiosity, speak about love of learning, and these are fundamental traits and characteristics which every club, every organization or sporting body should be kind of welcoming and taking on board with their coaches. But nonetheless, we all know moments of success in any sport in this industry are quite fleeting. And something which you speak about really well on your podcast is the weight of coaching. It's something which is even the likes of Bill Walsh, Sir Alex Ferguson. I mean, can you earn the stripes as a coach without putting in all these hours? In terms of, we look at these great figures like Bill Walsh, Sir Alex Ferguson. Yeah, recent documentaries, recent books about the pair have indicated it wasn't all rosy and garden.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a lot, and I get it. I'm a highly analytical coach. I was building my own statistical models with my best mate in our living room in 2005. And like I said, I was the kid that was obsessed with X's and O's. And so I'm that way minded. And so it's funny that I've become a little bit of a lightning rod for coach wellness on the other end of the spectrum. But what that means is, like, I hate people using the term balance in what we do, because professional sport doesn't have balance and never will. We're not searching for work-life balance. We're searching for greater balance. So it can be, if you think of a seesaw, right? The seesaw right now is fully down on one end and fully up on the other. It can be more equally balanced. It's never going to be horizontal, because if you think that there's going to be work-life balance working for an NBA team where you play 82 games and you're flying, every second day, this is not the industry for you. And so let's not pretend that there's any semblance of balance. But what there can be is better. And what that might mean is, Mikel Arteta has recently talked about, I think he gets into the office at 9 a.m. and it's after, making breakfast for his kids. That is better than 6 a.m. having not seen the kids and they don't even know that you exist. And I think that's what we're aiming for. We don't want another Bobby Robson where his son is on his documentary being like, I actually have no idea who this man is. Right. And maybe it is just breakfast with your kid, making breakfast for your kids that is better. And so small changes, but I don't think we should be chasing this version of like work-life balance where we're actually doing far less than we need to.
True. The caveat I would have, however, is when we speak about high performance, people are awful limited in their interpretation of that word, Cody, and they reflect on that person in their incarnation in whatever job they're in. For me, it's about the holistic performance or the holistic development of that individual. And I think, luckily, now we're starting to see a lot more coaches, a lot more people working in the sporting industry that have done that work on themselves in terms of understanding their values, their mission, their purpose. But for such a long time, we're seeing people just sleepwalking into these roles, into these jobs. And at times it is a blind love for the sport itself. And yeah, I do agree fundamentally that there is no real balance. I mean, for me, in terms of my own role within what I'm doing now, to the ordinary person on the street, you could not say it's balanced. But however, do I love what I'm doing? Of course. Does it energize me? Yes. And fundamentally, those are the two most important questions I can answer.
Yeah, exactly. understanding your, and as we've been talking about, your values and what you value in general can change, right? And so I think it's the awareness of what you're getting yourself into, whether you have the energy for that, and then saying no when your answer is no, right? And so becoming a mercenary coach that takes every opportunity might be okay at a particular time in your life. becoming the coach that rescues teams from relegation for, in exchange for money to set your family up for the rest of their life might be okay at a particular time in your life. It might actually energize you. That's okay too. But I think, to your point, it's having the awareness to know that, and then when it doesn't align, you say no to that opportunity.
And you think in elite sport we've done enough to create a safe haven to have these conversations?
No, we haven't. And again, I also think as head coaches, I don't think we've done a particularly good job of outlining what it is we do, what we require, what clubs can do to help us. I think we've been quite insular. We don't explain to the fans what coaching is. And so we also can't really be grumbly if we're not willing to share, what the challenges are, what actual coaching is, explaining tactical moves, explaining why you made substitutions. We've shut all that down to protect ourselves, to not have to deal with the newspaper headlines. But what that means is that no one understands. And so, I think there's opportunities for us to meet owners halfway. There's opportunities for us to meet fans halfway. There's opportunities for us to meet players halfway and explain to players what coaching is outside of your game model, right? So everyone gets up, and because their badges have taught them a game model and some drills, and like, this is what I believe. That's not coaching. That's a part of it. But, that's not being a head coach, is just chucking up a couple of, here's how we want to press in the forward third. Like, anyone can do that. Surely you've got more behind it, and explain that to the players, and how you're going to react to certain things, and what the process is going to look like. And I think when we start to meet people halfway, I think we're all going to be in a better spot for that as well.
And are there any organizations that are perhaps engaged in this best practice model at the moment, Cody?
Well, it's hard to tell, because if they are, you're probably not going to hear about it.
Yeah, and you're not in demand, really. In an ideal and fair world, perhaps a bit unfair to say, your role wouldn't exist. This is the thing. It's like that old adage about teaching a man how to fish, right?
No, that's exactly it. It's not unfair to state that at all. The role that I currently have shouldn't exist.
You envisage that changing? Not anytime soon, but perhaps within your lifetime?
I think it'll be slow, but it can speed up. Like anything else in sport, it's a copycat. And so what will happen eventually is someone will win doing what I'm doing, and there'll be a newspaper article or an interview or something that is kind of held up as a little bit of a bastion. And then, like Moneyball and like strength and conditioning and like sports psychology and like everything else before it, people will say, well, that's the way.
But
And
sorry to interrupt, but you don't want to have that idea prostituted against its very value. And this is the danger for me, that it's great to see the work you're doing, and countless others are. But what I find is, sometimes for most people within the industry that exist on the outsides, it's just an easy click on social media. It's like, oh, we'll just kick the can down the road even further.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. So I'm really interested in how this world evolves. I think there's I mean, the optimum model is to have this role internal and have coaches who want to be coached and demand to be coached and demand to have their own person with them dedicated full time, like a Guardiola, like a Jones. So not everyone's going to have the resources to do that, but I think that's really the optimum model. And that person then once internally can also have obviously a huge knock-on effect to coach development, coach education. I call it coaching performance. So, the well-being of all of the coaches, not just the head coach, and the education of all the coaches and the applied education, not just the researcher. We don't need more researchers. We have too much research, most of which isn't particularly applicable to what we actually need. And so that would be the optimum model. Some will go with that. Some already have that. Man City, unsurprisingly, already have that role. So again, if you want to play copycat, the examples that you would want are already in place. And now it's up to everyone else to either follow or say, no, that's crap. We don't need that. We pay the coach a lot of money to put up with all this crap and to educate themselves and to take care of their own well-being. And those clubs will be what they are.
And I suppose as the days of the autocrat come to a close and since we're speaking about the future, you're someone who's obviously also involved in the hiring process of many coaches, Cody. I mean, what qualities now are organizations looking towards, and which qualities, characteristics should a future coach be looking at obtaining?
Well, I'll be honest with you. A lot of organizations don't know what qualities they're looking for outside of the kind of traditional, what the system pumps out, which is, a game model, and it doesn't go much further than that. And so, that's a good place to start, is what else does the role entail? And, particularly for a head coach now, the role is so big that a lot of them don't coach. Like, it's shockingly small amount of actual coaching that head coaches do. And so the first thing that I would really look for is, understanding of organizational dynamics, because a head coach these days is really a CEO. So their job is to work across pillars of the organization, whether that be the performance pillars or the business pillars, creating overlap between them so they're not fighting against each other, organizing, coordinating. You've got all the logistics, you've got all of the planning falls under, you've got analytics now, you've got all these departments of PhDs. And so that's all organizational dynamics that, again, your badges don't teach you that stuff. You kind of need to learn along the way. And a second point would be someone that can speak confidently whilst being the face of the organization. And that's not necessarily always about the game. So I look at what Thomas Tuchel is having to do right now in terms of being the face of Chelsea. And shockingly, no one has come down really from the front office to help him. He's being asked to talk about geopolitics and governmental sanctioning of finances and coaching a football team, and has kind of been left to his own devices. And so you better be pretty strong at navigating those kind of things, because they can just appear out of anywhere, and it has nothing to do with, like I said, overlapping wing backs or pushing an extra person into the midfield. Right. And and the third piece, which I was tweeting about the other day, which I think is where this question might have come from, but I look for coaches that understand what they actually believe and aren't just regurgitating someone else's drills. So I get sent a lot of game models. I get sent a lot of pitches before, I also help coaches get jobs. And so I look through a lot of presentations, and my first question is always the same: is where are you in all of this? All of these, structures, and going to play, 4-4-2 and this and that. I want to know where you are. Why do you believe these things? Why do you believe that this team should play this way? Because, anyone can just assemble drills that they've found along the way that famous people have used, or go and read Bill Walsh's book and regurgitate that. But I want to know you as a person, Connor. What do you believe? Why do you believe in this particular thing? And if you can get those things, I think you're on a pretty good path as an organization that's hiring a new head coach.
And in terms of the percentage of uptake in that, Cody, in terms of people that are authentic to their game model, in terms that have done the work and their values, what would you say that to be?
It's a very small percentage. I don't know about giving it a value, but yeah, not a lot even really have their own values kind of mapped out.
And is this across multiple sports, or is it across just a select few?
So I work across team invasion sports.
And this is mapped out across different continents, different countries, of course.
Yeah, Olympic sports, professional team sports. Yeah, and again, the old. I keep kind of going at badges, and I don't mean to, keep calling them out, but really there's the old saying, every system is perfectly created for what the outcomes that it's getting. And so our coach education system is perfectly created for pumping out coaches who think that tactics are everything about the game. And so that's what you get. At the end, the result is that there's very rarely any factoring in of even emotion as a category for the coach themselves or the team. You might get lucky and you might go through the German system and they spend a lot of time on psychology. But for the most part, we're just focusing on the performance outcomes of the team, how to measure them and then how to deliver them, and missing a lot of the humanity pieces. So what are your actual values? Can your values be different as a person and as a coach? Should they be the same? Do they need to be the same? How are you going to manage up? How are you, those kind of things. The system doesn't really create coaches like that.
And having spent this podcast elaborating upon the culture and profession and speaking about others, Cody, what about yourself? I mean, have you any other further books or projects even in the pipeline?
Yeah, I'm in the middle of writing a book right now about craft of coaching, and some of the things that, again, are probably missing from the way that we're educating ourselves. The emotional one is an obvious one, but there's a lot more to it, right? There's team dynamics and energy and things like that. Owen and I spoke about that on our podcast for quite some time. It's just a topic unto itself. Energy, how do you read the energy of a collective? There's not a lot of research behind that. A lot of it is to do with, one-on-one exchanges. So like, can I read your emotions? We're looking at each other right now, Connor, and I can, you've got a bit of a smirk on your face. And so I can interpret that in a bunch of different ways. But when you extrapolate that out, I use the example of an NFL coach. It's like 53 people walk into the locker room before the game and at halftime. How do I get a gauge of the collective energy of that group? That is a coaching skill. You need to be finely attuned to what's going on there. And it might be split. They might not have a collective energy. There might be half that are worried about their contract because it's not going well. And there might be half that are energized by what happened. And, the fourth receiver finally got a catch in the 16th game and he's buzzing, but no one else is. And so being able to put that together and decide whether to intervene, not intervene, that stuff's really interesting me at the moment. I call that craft or nuance. of coaching. And so I'm exploring that in my next book, the third of the trilogy.
Cody, we'll certainly have to get you back on for part 2 when it's all said and done. But look, absolutely excellent, very insightful. You've left me stumped on a few points, which I must go and investigate now for myself and broaden my own horizons. But for everybody listening, what I'll do is I'll attach Cody's stuff below. Great book, The Tough Stuff, and of course his podcast, Where Others Won't. Cody, thanks a million for coming on, and hope to hear from you soon.
Thanks for having me.